Now, recent reports detail a brutal escalation in Sudan's Darfur region, where the Rapid Support Forces and allied militia have launched attacks targeting displacement camps and the city of Fasher. Over a two-day period, these assaults resulted in at least 100 deaths, including children and aid workers, and forced around 2,400 people to flee their homes. Now, key camps such as Zamzam and Abu Shorouk, which shelters over 700,000 displaced persons, have suffered severe destruction, further deepening an already critical humanitarian crisis amidst a prolonged conflict. This particular situation underscores an urgent call for international intervention to address both the intensifying conflict and the worsening humanitarian disaster. Now, joining us on this topic, we have Hala Al-Karib, Regional Director SIHA in Kampala, Uganda, and also Dr Majduline El-Haj El-Tahir, a political analyst in Oslo, Norway. Thank you so much, ladies, for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us.
All right, so let me begin with Hala. Hala, recent reports indicate that RSF-led attacks have claimed the lives of at least 100 people, including that of children, and also aid workers, 9 of them. How do you think, how can these be addressed? You know, these alarming breaches of international humanitarian law, how can they be addressed?
Well, it has been horrific 48 hours that the population of Zamzam IDPs camps have been living through. As you have said, 9 health workers have been killed, other volunteers and, women community kitchens, frontline workers has been also killed. 4 of the women community workers who are leading the work on behalf of my organization in Zamzam camps, they have also been killed. We have been living in a nightmare. Many of the volunteers that we are working with, we cannot locate them yet. People are scattered all over the place. There is no safe corridors. The attack has happened, the day before yesterday and was extremely brutal, and it was very much targeted. The infrastructure of one of Darfur's biggest displaced camps. Zamzam was established by 2003. It's a place where majority of the Darfuri people who were forced to evacuate their villages and their towns for the past 22 years, have been living there. So this is, an episode of an ongoing crisis, ongoing atrocities that has been happening for more than 22 years, while the international community is turning a blind eye. The African Union and the UN, they had a peacekeeping mission in Darfur between 2008 and until 2020. Unfortunately, by 2020, this mission ceased by the Security Council, leaving, Darfuri people quite exposed, to this horrific violation that did not stop even for an hour.
Quite a sad one. Let's hear from Dr. El-Tahir. Dr. El-Tahir, Hala did say that due to this particular incident, there are some volunteers that she's working with that have still not been located. What does this say about the safety of humanitarian workers and also the challenges that they face on the ground?
I think Hala been working in the UN system for so many years, and with her experience, perhaps she has a better overview and statistics about the risks of aid workers. However, as a normal civilian and a political activist without particular speciality in the field of humanitarian aid, I think often and again, both civilians and humanitarian workers in a completely chaotic situation in Darfur for over 22 years have been systematically targeted. And I don't think the targeting of civilians and aid workers is a coincidence. It is never ever a coincidence. It's always with the aim of destabilizing a specific group of people starving a specific group of people. So targeting aid workers is a matter of fact a means of targeting the civilians, another means of targeting the civilians. And we have seen it happening in Darfur repeatedly in 22 years.
Okay. Now, still on you, Dr. El-Tahir. Now, the UN reports that, or let me just pass this question to Hala before we come back to you. The UN reports that nearly 25 million Sudanese, that's half the population, are facing extreme hunger as well, with famine confirmed in multiple regions. Over 12 billion people displaced, including 13 million children in need of humanitarian assistance. How are aid organizations like yours coping with such a number?
Well, first of all, let me start with where Majduline has stopped, that this is a targeted attack, and this is the man-made famine, and the infrastructures of displaced camps, infrastructures of, Darfur cities and towns has been the target of aggression for the past 22 years. And, to force the population to move out of the villages. And so many productive communities, they turn to displaced people roaming from one place to another. They don't know where to go. So in terms of aid workers and NGOs and civil society organizations like ours, it's extremely difficult. Sudan, although being one of the most horrific humanitarian crises in the world, it's the least crisis that is getting attention from the international community. It's the least crisis that's receiving any sort of support. We speak to people at UN OCHA, we speak to people at UN Women and at UNFPA, and the level of support, it hardly exceeds, or sometimes it's below 5%, to sustain humanitarian operations. And so people are literally starving. Zamzam IDB's camp itself that was attacked, 2 days ago, and is still under attack. It's one of the famine spots that was identified by the United Nations. And so the lack of protection, let me say it clearly, Sudan crisis is clearly a protections crisis. This is not a civil war. This is where women bodies and children bodies has been used as a weapon of war. And this is, this is the problem, that people, they approach it as if it is a civil war. It's not a civil war. This is a serious crisis of protections. We are quite exposed. We are held hostages to all forms of violations, and we need a serious intervention. To be honest with you, we are very disappointed by the African Union. We are very disappointed by the leadership of the African continent in terms of enabling these atrocities to happen against Sudanese and to happen against Darfuri indigenous African populations systematically.
Well, Hala, you talked about it being a man-made famine. What immediate measures are being taken, to secure food supplies and essential resources for these vulnerable populations?
Well, it's Sudanese population. I'm sure Dr. Majduline can speak to that. It's a diaspora community. It's Sudanese volunteers who are standing at the front line and providing aid and support for their own, taking all kinds of risk and exposing themselves to killing, exposing themselves to being detained and jailed and tortured, and this is so most of the resources, it's actually being accumulated from the local communities. The World Food Program is providing food portions to the places where they could access. There are so many places that the WFP cannot access at the moment. The infrastructure of the country is under attack. Sudan until now doesn't have a very serious negotiation table that could look at, stopping these atrocities. Processes of justice and accountability is not working, and to hold the perpetrators accountable. Sexual violence is quite prevalent. My country is the capital of sexual violence in the world at this point in time, and so on. So as I said, it's a protection crisis. It's a man-made crisis. and the lack of protections, the African Union, the international community are abdicating their responsibility towards Sudan, which is extremely sad. This is the third largest country in Africa. This is a country that's bordering 7 countries, and what's happening in Sudan, is clearly affecting its neighbors. So something has to be done.
Okay. Now, Dr. El-Tahir, now the RSF has actually been accused of targeting civilians and committing atrocities in Darfur. And also, Hala talked about, the Zamzam camp, and the RSF claims that, the Zamzam camp was used by mercenary factions, and that actually justifies their assault. What impact does such narrative have on this conflict?
Let me move from the humanitarian aspect to the political aspect, because we can't talk about the war without talking about the politics of the war. Now, here we have a situation whereby there are two fighting bodies, two fighting parties, fighting what is becoming more and more increasingly a very complex web of foreign intervention by outside countries into the conflict of the Sudan. Some countries are supporting one side, other countries are supporting one side. And therefore, I think I believe that the conflict, the fighting in the last 2 days is just a question. It's not an escalation. It is just a shift of the hot center of the war. Shift from Al Jazeera, which was a few months ago, shift where back to Darfur. So violence is coming home. It's never left really home, meaning Darfur, but violence is coming home because the regional powers, the international powers, they have an invested interest, not just in the Sudan, but in the whole of the Horn of Africa. The situation in the Sudan is not very far from escalations in southern Sudan most recently. It's not very far and not unconnected to escalations in the DRC, which I saw glimpses of your interview now. This is a targeted attack on the resources of the Horn of Africa, the position of the Horn of Africa on the Red Sea, the Red Sea, which is basically the area where all superpowers are fighting over now, and therefore to simplify it's just sometimes they kind of play dumb, the international community, and as if this is some kind of ethnic puzzle that cannot be resolved and so on. No, this is not about ethnicity. This is not about religion. This is not about Arabs against Africans, Muslims against Christians. This is about resources. There is a huge need for the resources of the Horn of Africa, and that requires demolishing all the people of Africa, of the north of Africa, moving them away from their places, uprooting them from their lands, so that the land and the rivers and the seas are to serve the superpowers and their supporting regional powers. That be for the RSF or be for the military. And it is becoming more, it has always been, but it's becoming more aggressive. And therefore here, I just want to add two things. Where can we find support? In 3 areas. In our own internal Sudanese mechanisms, in a real, genuine, serious support of African countries to each other, because what's happening in Sudan is not going to the countries in West Africa. If the whole of East Africa collapses, that doesn't guarantee any stability for West Africa. And the third one is to empower our institutions, despite all
Dr.
the of the United Nations, of the African Union, of the ICC. We have to empower these international institutions, because without these institutions, we will be in a jungle. And indeed, we are now in the jungle. And in that jungle, we need these 3 mechanisms in order to be able to for the citizen of East Africa to ever exist.
Well, Dr. El-Tahir, sorry
problem.
for cutting you short, right? Now, just in addition to what you talked about, Sudan's foreign minister has actually accused the UAE of complicity in RSF atrocities, right? I would love for you to speak to us on external actors' influence in the direction of Sudanese civil war. And also, if you could talk about the upcoming international conference in London that is aimed at resolving the civil war. Are there any realistic outcomes that you're expecting, especially with key warring parties, you know, being excluded, since you compared the conflict in Sudan with that of the DRC?
Your first question about the UAE, and the case against the UAE, I think Sudan and Sudanese government, which we didn't choose, he came through a coup d'etat that need to be emphasized. However, they are within their right to take the UAE to the ICC, and the UAE's involvement in supporting the RSF is not something undocumented, it's documented. The United Nations Committee itself, Commission has proven that. The question is why the Sudanese coup d'etat government, why do they do that? I don't think they're doing it for justice, because they themselves are, their hands are heavily involved in Sudanese blood. What they are doing it, I think, is because of two reasons. Number one, to give themselves a legitimacy, which they don't have. And the second one, the second one is to give themselves to very quickly. There is a parallel government that has been declared in Nairobi in November last year, whereby the RSF, together with SPLA in southern Kordofan and in the Nuba Mountains, they formed a kind. They are going to form a kind of government. So what the move now, I think, is from the government is to cut short that parallel government. What does that mean? That means that it will give the military and the regional powers, which is for the military, a upper hand over the RSF and the UAE, which supports the RSF. So, so here is not a question of sovereignty of the Sudan. It's not a question of justice. It's not a question of protecting the people of the Sudan. This move is in order to ensure they have, when the negotiations come, and they are coming, so that they have an upper hand and they have a card to play against the UAE and a bargaining chip against the UAE. That is the reason why they're sending it. Your second one is about the conference in London.
Yes, briefly, please.
I think the conference in London, the outcome of it is not going to be very impactful because, number one, it's not because the warring parties are not involved, but because the warring parties are empowered every day in front of all these countries, including the United Kingdom, which is hosting the conference. The United Kingdom and the United States, as an example, they have their battleships in the Red Sea, and they have the intelligence as well. If they want to stop the war in the Sudan without any military intervention, and I'm not calling for military intervention, I'm calling for just, if you just stop the line of arming the RSF, the line of gold exports from the Sudan to the UAE, which, by the way, goes via Nairobi government as well, with the blessing of the government of Nairobi. If you could stop that, then there is not going to be any war in the Sudan, and you are going to save the Sudan.
All right. So sorry, I would have to cut you short here. Actually, time isn't on our side, and we'd love to hear from Hala before we wrap up. Hala, can you tell us, just as we wrap up, how does the UN or even other organizations, aid organizations, view the role of regional partners, including neighboring countries like Chad and also South Sudan, in managing the refugee crisis and also contributing to regional stability?
Well, Sudanese refugees are in a very dire situation. You know, they have been targeted, they were exposed to death, they were exposed to, different levels of violations. And as I said, there is so much close connections, between Chad and Sudan, between South Sudan and Sudan. So the tension and the conflict is often transferred into the other side, and often, peaceful communities and displaced and refugee community, they tend to become victimized. Yeah. As I said, this is primarily a protection crisis. And this is a crisis that has been also resulted on decades of impunity and neglect of Sudan, but it's also, a crisis that's largely caused by Sudanese political and military elites themselves in terms of, their act of neglect and often complicity, with foreign actors. Having said that, I think what's really important at this point in time is to look at 40 million Sudanese people who are literally dying every day, as a result of violence, as a result of the flow of arms that's coming, unfortunately from regional countries, and as I said earlier, Sudan is too large to fall apart alone. Very important.
So sorry about that, Hala, but time is not on our side, but we really appreciate both of you for coming on the show and also speaking on this. Hala Al-Karib, Regional Director, SIHA, that's a strategic initiative for women in the Horn of Africa in Uganda at the moment, and also Dr Majduline El-Haj El-Tahir, political analyst in Norway. Thank you so much, ladies.